Last time we talked a lot about Shalltear's creation and her preferences, and I ended off by asking the question, if she's a vampire who has the inherent ability to turn people into her obedient slaves, then why go through this whole process of abuse to achieve the same outcome? Well, let's answer that, and then go over the rest of the details that went into making Shalltear this paradoxical fusion between a sadistic, predatory vampire and a goofy, adorable little girl. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, but yes, that side of her does exist. We just haven't covered it yet. But first, this video is sponsored by Overlord, a free-to-play 2.5D side-scrolling action MMORPG featuring both PvE and PvP across now 13 different customizable characters, each with their own classes that affect both gameplay mechanics and lore. It's very easy to pick up, and I personally found that it caters well to both casual gamers with its story mode and quick level progression, as well as hardcore gamers with the PvP arena. And given that there are 13 characters, each with their own skills, intros, stories, artwork, and icons, there's definitely a lot to take in with this game. Speaking of which, Overlord also just recently added their newest character named Labby, a hybrid brawler and ranged fighter, equipped with her fists and her best friend that doubles as a sentient mirror that fires projectiles. Her story is independent from the main character storyline of the game, providing for a brand new starting area and lore that brings with it new Asian mythology-inspired monsters and zones. So if any of that interests you, then go ahead and try out Overlord and Labby for free today through the link in the description. Now, let's begin. So, why doesn't Shalltear use her vampire abilities to just turn people into slaves? Well, it's long been argued that vampires are an allegory for sexual domination and abuse. What I mean by that is that the very idea of a vampire could be seen as a symbol of fantasy and fiction that hides another deeper, or in this case, somewhat darker concept. It's able to hint at those concepts through abstraction. The quintessential vampire typically steals into the homes of young women each night, slowly draining their blood and, in the process, corrupting them, turning them into fellow vampires who end up also feeling the need to create new victims. It's often said that only those who are pure can be turned into vampires, and those who are not end up becoming dilapidated husks or zombies. Symbolically speaking then, the vampire's ability to corrupt thus works best on the innocent. They're this creature of the night that slowly builds an army of lesser vampires to do their every bidding. So what's not to say that one of the purposes of them is for a harem of submissive slaves? Of course, no fictional works with vampires is as blatant in that regard as Overlord is with Shalltear, but the way Overlord portrays this fits very well to Paradoxical's characteristics. He didn't want his NPC to be symbolic or hint at his fetishes. No, he wanted her to embody them. And so, while Shalltear has the power to build herself a harem of slaves via enthralling eyes or draining their blood, she's still quite inclined to indulge in those traditional methods of abuse and domination to accomplish the same goal. As a matter of fact, it's actually one of her favorite hobbies. What we have with Shalltear is not an allegory that merely hints at these darker aspects of domination. She's a being who is paradoxically both a vampire, as well as what the vampire is meant to symbolically allude to. You see, Overlord is meant to be a somewhat comedic take on traditional villain archetypes, but Shalltear illustrates for us exactly what it might take for a villain to actually create the kinds of servants that AniNews has. It's in contrast to how other servants are gained on accident or through coincidence, or even magical powers. There's an amusing parallel to be made here with AniNews' relationship with the NPCs. Not only is the deeply ingrained loyalty and dependence quite similar, but in case you didn't notice, AniNews has something of his own harem between Aura, Shalltear, and Albedo. And it's also a frequent joke in the light novel that even the male guardians would go for AniNews if he demanded it, as if they too would be more than willing to join his harem. This of course being another extension of their deep loyalty. Which brings us to Shalltear's relationship with AniNews. This is the side of Shalltear that we generally see the most of. Much like Albedo, she fantasizes about being with AniNews. But unlike Albedo, she acts quite submissive around him. We saw this most clearly from her face of enjoyment during the famous Shalltear scene. But that's not the only incident where she expressed that type of enjoyment. Back when AniNews first entered the New World, he had a bit of a mix-up with his Aura Affair, an undead passive ability that subjects nearby targets with a minor debuff. He had accidentally blasted the Guardians, including Shalltear, with this intimidating aura, and Shalltear just claimed that it made her very, moist. Not only that, one of the first lines that she ever utters to Ainz refers to him as her master, the only person who she can't rule over, coming across as if she's excited that she can't dominate him. Which makes you wonder then, why would someone who is so abusive and domineering also enjoy being abused and dominated? She doesn't really come across as the type who's willing to be submissive to others. So why would Pararoncino create a dominatrix fantasy but then make her submissive as well? What did Pararoncino design her to be? All good questions that we can really only answer by looking at Pararoncino. For starters, it's pretty clear that he had an interest in Yuri, and that made its way to Shalltear as outlined by her noted experiences with the vampire brides and Arsh. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that she was intended to be a lesbian. But that's not all there is. Here's the important part. Do you really think that a guy like Pararoncino would create a character that meets his every desire and not have them be attracted to him in any way? Of course not. Pararoncino's ideal fantasy woman is primarily into other women, yes, but one who swings both ways and in turn would also be willing to sleep with him. Put simply, he created Shalltear to enjoy the things that he enjoys as well as look like the things that he's personally attracted to. If that's the case, then what fact did he most likely bury deep in Shalltear's biography? What ultimate fantasy did Pararoncino imbue within her? If we put all the clues together, then it would be that Shalltear would be amenable to becoming his own personal slave, or just the slave of any of the Supreme Ones for that matter. Just like how Shalltear enjoys using her power and authority to torment her underlings, perhaps Pararoncino wrote for Shalltear to respect the power of the Supreme Ones, as well as desire to be dominated by them. Then again, Momonga and Pararoncino were good friends, so maybe Pararoncino wrote that Shalltear would just go for him specifically. Anyway, what we can gather from this is that just like she punishes her underlings, so too does she expect to be punished for her own failings. Clearly, Albedo was onto something when she suggested that punishment would be the best way to rescue Shalltear from her depression after the events of Season 1. Now, regarding those very failures, let's talk about how they've influenced her character. You may not have realized this, but she's actually had a bit of a character arc going on in the background, which is more developed later on in the light novel. One which, due to various canonical changes, wasn't really present in the web novel. You see, Shalltear was quite the arrogant vampire, and while that is a common trait amongst vampires, this tendency towards arrogance is also shared by most of the NPCs. They view themselves as inherently superior to those not created by the Supreme Ones, though fairly warranted given their nearly godlike power. That said, Shalltear has an interesting dynamic to this arrogance that you wouldn't find in someone like Albedo or Demiurge. You see, Shalltear is actually kind of dumb. Initially, this could have been chalked up to overconfidence in her own capabilities and power, since she is a min-maxed level 100 NPC. You can attribute this to the fact that Pararoncino was also a power gamer. Don't forget, even though I've spent the entire first video and the beginning of this one talking about how cultured he was still an active member of a top guild of Yggdrasil. As such, he relentlessly tinkered with his build and equipment in order to squeeze just a little more power out of it. He would forego any sense of cosmetics or aesthetics on his equipment if it meant coming at the cost of his gameplay performance. Thus, it's no surprise that he designed Shalltear to be the ultimate 1v1 fighter, though more information on that will be discussed when we talk about how strong she is in the next video. What you need to know for now is that, aside from Rubedo, she can beat anyone in Nazarick in a 1v1, disregarding the fully equipped and prepped version of Ainz, of course. So when Ainz sent her off into the kingdom back in Season 1, with orders to track down a mage or warrior with powerful abilities, Shalltear didn't think to have any contingencies or backup plans. She simply didn't think it was a possibility that she'd encounter an unforeseen situation, or a powerful foe that could damage her chances of success. It's not like that was even a particularly bad assumption on her part. For instance, in the light novel, the bandit camp that she raided had filled the surrounding forest with traps, and her vampire brides had repeatedly stumbled into them, since they didn't have any rogue or ranger levels to detect them with. Still, given their high level and vampiric qualities, something like a bear trap wasn't particularly threatening. The traps barely did any damage, and what little they did do rapidly healed. It was incidents like these and her encounter with Brain that only reinforced Shalltear's belief that she had nothing to concern herself with. Unfortunately, what neither she nor Ainz anticipated was the possibility that denizens of the New World would use a world item to bypass her inherent immunities and overcome the level difference. As it turns out, the Slain Theocracy has a large quantity of powerful artifacts from Yggdrasil players who arrived in the New World in centuries past, including some of the all-powerful world items which could override the rules of the world itself. This was a plot point that wasn't really prominent in the anime, but it's hinted repeatedly in the light novel that Ainz wasn't the first player to arrive in the New World, or even the last. It's also hinted that players arrive in large groups, approximately once every century or so. In any case, the Slain Theocracy's elite Black Ops unit, the Black Scripture, they'd been investigating the area due to a prophecy which foretold great doom, no doubt having something to do with Ainz's appearance in the area. So by chance, they just happened to encounter Shalltear. One of their members, the elderly woman Lady Care, she possessed the world item Downfall of Castle and Country, and this had the power to bring any target under the control of the wielder, though only one target at a time, and she immediately made the decision to use it against Shalltear after seeing the power and threat that she possessed. Fortunately for Shalltear, she managed to grievously wound the caster shortly before the effect completed, leaving Shalltear without any orders to act on. This resulted in her just standing there, waiting for someone to arrive. Alright, so in this case, you can't really blame her for not anticipating a world item. Hell, she didn't even know they existed. But to a mastermind like Demiurge, her lack of preparation and caution was obviously flawed. She had no way of knowing for sure that there was absolutely nothing out there to be concerned about. So the prudent thing to do would have been to investigate things more carefully, or at least set up some contingency plans. For instance, she could have had a minion on standby to report back to Nazarick in the case of a disaster. Instead, it took significant time for Nazarick to realize that her mission had been compromised. In fact, had the mind control been completely successful, the secrecy of Nazarick would have been greatly compromised. It was because of this lack of basic care and attention that Demiurge would go on to consider her a liability and a screw-up, exemplified best during the raid on the kingdom in Season 2. Demiurge had Shalltear wait in reserve as a backup unit, rather than participate actively in the operation, all the while lecturing and patronizing her about her inattentiveness and unreliability. She was still assigned to the mission, but Demiurge didn't want to place her in a role of any importance, just in case she would screw up and diminish the chances of success. The pre-mind-controlled Shalltear would have been indignant and outraged at this turn of events. I mean, even before her operation in the kingdom, during the ride in the carriage, Sibas had quietly suggested that she might not be a fit for the mission that she had been assigned. And after hearing this, she became so outraged at the thought that she had immediately demanded he fight to the death in mortal combat. But the Shalltear in Season 2, she could only muster up a little bit of resistance and stammer out a half-hearted objection when Demiurge was patronizing her. Something had clearly changed between Shalltear of Season 1 and Season 2. As it turns out, being mind-controlled had greatly humbled her. Not only had she failed in her mission, she had turned her weapon upon one of her beloved Supreme Ones, and lost. Shalltear was not just a failure as a general-purpose servant. Her much-vaunted skill and powerful build wasn't nearly the trump card that she believed it to be. She was useless, both as a servant to follow orders, but also as a weapon to crush Ainz's enemies. And when Demiurge, one of the most intelligent guardians, began doubting her abilities, she presumed that Ainz had also lost faith in her. After all, if one of the smartest guardians thought of her as a failure, wouldn't the unfathomably smart Ainz himself think even worse of her? To lose the favor of one of the Supreme Ones, her self-confidence was broken, and she spiraled into a deep depression. Because of this, she would spend her time trying to dull the pain by drinking at the bar. This only worsened the situation because this depressive spiral resulted in even Ainz beginning to buy the idea that Shalltear was actually a bit incompetent. As such, he had ended up putting her in charge of Nazarick's transportation network. It may sound like an important duty, but it was actually really simple. Her only job was to stand around in Nazarick all day and wait for someone to contact her telepathically with instructions to open up a teleportation gate to a specific location. So while Cocytus, Aura, and Mare were off conquering the entirety of the region surrounding Nazarick, and Demiurge and Albedo were running the entirety of Nazarick's foreign and domestic operations, the only thing Shalltear was trusted to do for months on end was be a walking portal dispenser. She took to the task as earnestly as she could, but the assignment was clearly a huge blow to her self-esteem. Even she could realize what such menial work signified, even if it was fairly important. It was through this process that Shalltear's personality began to shift, ever so subtly. Her old one, where she was always eager to abuse and dominate others, was built upon her self-confidence in her own power. This was when her domineering vampire side was at its strongest. But when that was all peeled away, what was she left with? Well, put simply, it was the other half of her character, the one that her visual design was meant to allude to, that innocent, childlike little girl. To her underlings, sure, she may be a vicious, sociopathic tyrant, but to the other Guardians and Ainz, she comes across as a bit goofy and overeager. She goes from all-powerful tyrant who is respected and feared, to one who is patronized and looked down on. Pretty much what could just be summed up as a cute but childish little girl. I don't want to spoil any of the light novels, so I'll just say that subsequent volumes follow up on this shift in her character arc. You can look forward to more on that. Anyway, I'm not sure how much of this side of her was actually intended on the part of Pararoncino. Perhaps he designed her with this duality in mind. Perhaps his ideal fantasy was a woman who masked her insecurity and childishness with a dominant superiority complex. Perhaps in his fantasies he would subject Shalltear to the same treatment she gave to others, and she would then discover that she enjoyed being dominated more than she enjoyed dominating others. Maybe it was even a Toho Dojin reference. Or, what's most likely, is that she inherited that aspect of her personality from him. After all, while Pararoncino was an adult like everyone else, I suspect he was seen by the other members of the guild as the most childish and immature. You can imagine how the other guildmates viewed him, and it wouldn't be surprising if goofy little kid was one of those viewpoints. This tendency was no doubt exacerbated by the fact that his older sister, Buku Buku Chugama, was also in the guild. She was quite strict and hard on him, always lecturing him about one thing or the other. She was always being embarrassed by whatever antics he was getting into. On the other hand, he was a comedian type who didn't like taking things too seriously, so she always felt the need to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't up to no good. Perhaps because of this, Shalltear inherited a bit of that childishness as well. She even tends to be patronized most prominently by Aura, who paradoxically finds her exasperating and annoying, but also can't help but keep a bit of an eye out for her. I mean, she was one of the NPCs created by Buku Buku Chugama. Just as an NPC inherits aspects of their personality from their creator, NPC relationships also mirror that of their creators. Hence why Aura looks after Shalltear much in the same way that Buku Buku Chugama looked after Pararoncino. Though usually, they've got a bit of a sibling rivalry going on, as Pararoncino actually wrote into Shalltear's biography that she would constantly pick fights with Aura, as if to try and guarantee that the two of them would have this bitter rivalry. This could be what causes Shalltear to constantly pick fights, not just with Aura, but with pretty much everyone. As I said last video, she's got quite the temper, fairly unlike Pararoncino. But I guess that just goes to show that even though NPCs do adopt some of the personality from their creator, the bulk of it is still derived from their biography. Anyway, that's everything about Shalltear as a character, the paradoxical fusion between a sadistic predatory vampire and a goofy, cutesy, adorable little girl. Pretty much everyone's favorite fictional vampire lolly. But be sure to join me next time as I go over how strong she really is. You already know that's gonna be a good one. Before I go, I'd like to thank Elsword once again for sponsoring this video. You can try it out for free today with the link in the description. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!